President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has repeatedly called for Russia to be stripped of its permanent Security Council status. It sounds like a logical response to an unprovoked invasion. The stakes are the survival of international law and the credibility of the United Nations itself. But here is what you need to know before accepting that solution as viable. The request is procedurally impossible under current rules, making it a political dead end rather than a legal pathway. By understanding why this deadlock exists, we uncover exactly how the UN structural design fails in our modern multipolar world and reveals the hard limits of collective security when great powers act against their own constraints. To understand the paralysis, you must first look at the specific mechanism for expulsion defined in Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. The process is not a simple vote where the majority can force removal. Instead, it requires a two-step sequence that creates an unbreakable logical loop. First, the General Assembly must recommend suspension by a two-thirds majority vote. Second, and this is the critical constraint, the Security Council must issue its own recommendation to approve that action. The Charter does not allow the General Assembly to act alone on membership issues of this magnitude. It forces a dependency between the body representing all member states and the smaller Executive Council where power is concentrated. This creates what we can call a distributed system deadlock, similar to removing a node from a network without its consent. Russia, as one of the 5 permanent members known as the P5, holds an absolute veto over any Security Council resolution regarding expulsion. Therefore, for Russia to be expelled, it must vote in favor of its own removal or at least abstain while other powers agree. Since no rational actor would voluntarily trigger their own ouster through a formal vote, and since unanimity among the permanent members is not required if only one agrees, the math works against expulsion entirely. The entity being targeted holds the keys to the lock that prevents it from leaving the room. Quick resource note: I keep a curated set of Amazon search links in the description for books, gear, and tools relevant to this channel's topics. Some are affiliate links, so I may earn a commission at no extra cost to you. Please consider supporting the channel by using those links if you find something useful. You might wonder why this specific design was chosen in 1945 rather than allowing for easier removal of aggressors. The answer lies in the founders' intent to prioritize great power stability over operational efficacy. They believed that if a permanent member could be expelled or stripped of power by a majority vote, they would simply walk away from the organization and refuse to participate in its security functions. This was not an oversight, but an intentional architectural feature designed to keep major powers inside the tent, even when their interests diverge sharply from those of smaller nations. The system assumes that the cost of losing a permanent member outweighs the benefit of removing them, effectively hard-coding a scenario where self-correction is impossible for P5 members who violate the Charter's core principles. The structural fragility becomes visible only when we look at how other bodies attempt to work around this constraint. In response to the invasion of Ukraine, 103 states signed a 2015 declaration urging permanent members to voluntarily suspend their veto powers during mass atrocities. This represents a significant political signal from the international community that moral pressure can influence behavior in extreme cases. However, these tools remain non-binding because they rely on voluntary compliance rather than enforceable law. The General Assembly did adopt Resolution 76262 to mandate immediate meetings following vetoes, creating what looks like a fallback architecture for bypassing gridlock. Yet this resolution lacks the enforcement mechanisms necessary to alter the legal status of any member state or override the Security Council's procedural requirements. This gap between political will and structural capability exposes the true nature of the UN in a multipolar world where national interests consistently override collective security goals. The reliance on non-binding declarations demonstrates that without amending the Charter, there is no clear mechanism to bypass the veto power for any purpose. And here we arrive at the most difficult reality. Even if you could amend the Charter through a two-thirds vote and ratification by all permanent members, the very people whose powers are being reduced would have to agree to those changes themselves. This creates an infinite loop where the system cannot change its own rules without the consent of those it seeks to constrain. The situation is further complicated when we examine how this structural rigidity affects other potential cases involving atrocity crimes. While some states argue for applying voluntary suspension mechanisms, Debates over the legal definition of what constitutes mass atrocities have prevented similar initiatives from being applied in Ukraine or elsewhere. This suggests that even moral pressure cannot bypass the rigid procedural architecture designed to protect state sovereignty above all else. The system is not broken by accident. It is functioning exactly as its designers intended for a world where gray powers agree on basic rules, but failing spectacularly when those powers diverge fundamentally from one another. This analysis reveals that the veto power acts as a single point of failure for the entire Council's legitimacy. When a permanent member initiates aggression against another state, the mechanism designed to check such behavior becomes inert because the aggressor holds the only tool capable of activating it. The result is not just procedural delay, but total paralysis in addressing the most severe violations of international peace and security. It forces smaller states into a position where they can voice outrage through resolutions that carry no legal weight, while being unable to enforce consequences against those who hold veto power. The implication for future geopolitical stability is profound. As the world becomes more multipolar with additional emerging powers seeking permanent seats or greater influence, this structural flaw may become even more pronounced if consensus among the P5 continues to erode. The current design assumes a level of great power cooperation that no longer exists in practice. Without a binding mechanism to bypass vetoes without requiring ratification from all 5 members, the organization remains dependent on political will rather than enforceable law. This leaves the international system vulnerable whenever one permanent member decides to act outside the established order while retaining full control over the tools meant to hold them accountable. The disconnect between strong General Assembly votes and Security Council silence is not a sign of democratic failure, but a feature of an institution built for stability rather than accountability in times of crisis. Understanding this dynamic shifts the conversation from what should be done procedurally to how states navigate a system where their primary security guarantees are conditional on the cooperation of potential adversaries. The real insight here is that no amount of political pressure can overcome a legal framework designed specifically to prevent exactly this type of removal, leaving the organization dependent on moral suasion in situations where force and law should apply. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. I am a one-person team working hard to make each video better than the last. Subscribe if you found value. It is the best way to show support. Drop a comment with your biggest takeaway. See you in the next video.